sexuality are complex would not be an understatement. Yet throughout time, we've taken such complicated concepts and have managed to reduce them to these simplistic binaries, such as male and female. So to understand the fluidity of gender and sexuality, we need to revisit the basics. Now, for most of us, the terms gender and sex are used interchangeably, and thus incorrectly. But this is not to say that it's not easy to confuse the two. However, it is important to remember that these two terms have next to nothing in common. Gender, sex, also known as biological gender, includes physical attributes like external genitalia, internal reproductive structures, sex chromosomes, hormones, that kind of stuff. And at birth, it's used to identify you and me as either male or female. Gender, however, is far more complicated than that. It's this interconnection, it's this interrelationship between your sex, your gender identity, which is this innermost understanding that you as a person have of yourself. It's how you perceive yourself and how you intend others to perceive you. And lastly, there's your gender expression, which is the way you externally communicate this gender identity to the people around you, in your voice, or your clothes, or your haircut, or in any other form of representation. Now, for the longest time, the societies around us have viewed gender as a strict binary system, consisting of two opposite sides, male and female. We are born, assigned a gender depending on what's between our legs, and are sent out into the world to adhere to the roles and expectations of the said gender. No questions asked. And to help us along, we're surrounded by these roles and expectations throughout our lives. In the way we are raised, in our schools, in our cultures, in our religions, these roles are embedded into our understanding of ourselves. So in these ways, gender is a social construct. It is monitored and reinforced in everything we see, from toys to clothes, behaviors, careers. These beliefs are embedded into our understanding of ourselves. However, for those of us who can conform to these societal rules and expectations for reasons beyond society's comprehension, when a person's gender identity clashes with these binary systems, they simply broaden the binary systems set by our societies. And then what? Then the diversity of gender is created. Like the way each of us in this room think about ourselves and who we are is different. The answer can't be the same, and why should it? This variation right here stops gender from being binary. It becomes so complex, so difficult to understand, but so beautiful. Now, the case is the same with the sexuality binary system, since the same defaults that determine our gender at birth are almost immediately used to determine our sexual orientation, which is the romantic or sexual attraction that you as a person have to people of the same gender as you, or people of a different gender as you, or both, or neither. So, let me present to you the dynamics of the sexuality binary system. Because it presents these societal expectations. So when a person's gender identity clashes with these societal expectations, they broaden them. And for similar reasons, the case is the same with the sexuality binary system. So, but before we start patting ourselves on the back for moving forward with all that lies on the spectrum of gender and sexuality, other less noticeable issues need to be addressed. Issues which I think best demonstrate this lack of fluidity within gender and sexuality. So by now, most of us are familiar with at least two letters in the ever-lengthening acronym that is the L, community. So let me present to you the dynamics that exist within this community that result in the internal stigmatization of an already stigmatized group of people. Now, from these two separate binary systems, the terms heteronormativity and cisnormativity are created. And simply put, heteronormativity is the belief that we are all born heterosexual, or straight, and as a result are attracted to members of the opposite sex, male to female, female to male. And then there's cisnormativity, which is the belief that we are all cisgender, meaning that our gender identity matches our sex. But with the existence of differing sexualities, a spectrum is created between homosexuality and heterosexuality. And as a result, these two separate concepts, heterosexuality and homosexuality, become the norms. They are at the edges of the spectrum. And as a result, they treat people within that spectrum, people whose sexualities differ from both, with varying degrees of acceptance. And personally speaking, I've had both heterosexual and homosexual people not understand my bisexuality because it's a slightly more complex sexual identity. Thank you guys. Because it's a slightly more complex sexual identity. And if you think about it in that way, the effects of the sexuality binary go both ways. And as a result, we tend to see both heterosexual and homosexual people marginalizing people whose identity becomes more complex than that. So, this variation, this mistreatment, in my opinion, exists for the same reason that homosexuality does, that homophobia does. Because gender fluidity and sexual fluidity have not yet been fully reconsidered. Now, this little girl had no idea what homosexuality was until she was 13 or 14. But she did know that the first 7 years of her straight, boy-obsessed life were just as valid as the next 10. And this is why we need to start viewing gender and sexuality as complex, because it's not something we can choose for others, only ourselves. It varies between people for a multitude of reasons. Like one person's gender identity can match with their sex as easily as another person's can change from one day to the next. And granted, this can get a little confusing, but it shouldn't be cause for worry or chaos. It just happens. It's that complex. So wouldn't it make all our lives a little bit easier if we could all have a say in the way we felt about who we are and how we presented ourselves to the world around us? It's that easy, or at least it should be. Thank you.